Okay, so welcome to the second edition of the Wrestling Guardian podcast. We're continuing our look at all of the different WrestleMania shows put on by the WWE over the years. Last week we looked at WrestleManias 1, 2, and 3. And I think generally we established that all three shows, kind of in their own way, did a very good job of establishing the WWF as the biggest wrestling company in the world. Today we're moving into WrestleManias 4, 5, and 6. And I guess the first kind of observation to make here is that while we're still very much in the Hulk Hogan era of WWF, you can kind of see examples of maybe Vince moving pieces into place. He maybe was coming to that realization that he couldn't rely on Hulk Hogan forever, and there would have to be people he could trust to, especially give the world title to now and again, just to kind of give Hogan a bit of support there. Um, as we move into WrestleMania 4, obviously one man that a lot of attention is drawn towards is Macho Man Randy Savage. I guess I just wanted to ask straight away, your overall thoughts on the Macho Man's position in the company at the time. Do you think he was the right man to go to as a kind of sort of number two for Hulk Hogan?
Yeah, and I think I think it was a no-brainer at the time, and Macho Man was a sort of rising star in the promotion. He was the over-the-top personality that the time period mandated, and there isn't really someone who could rival him per se in the promotion apart from Hulk Hogan. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the only other character who I really think of captivating from that time period, I mean, on the same sort of level as Randy Savage, I would say was Jake Roberts.
Yeah, and Jake Roberts is one of those guys that never really broke into the main event scene, and it's strange because if he was around today, you'd expect him to be one of the most captivating and interesting characters on the roster. But yeah, I agree. I think Savage was the ideal choice here. You had guys like Andre around, but he was kind of entering into the twilight of his career a little bit. He had a lot of guys on the roster that were showing a lot of promise, but weren't maybe quite ready to take that big leap into the main event scene. So yeah, I think Savage was the ideal man for the job here. Um, and then looking at WrestleMania 4, I mean, one thing I really love about the show, well, not necessarily the show in itself, but the lead up to the show and the events that led up to taking the title off Hogan. If you remember the main event match with Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant as a kind of rematch from WrestleMania 3.
Yes. I
Um,
think still the most viewed match in wrestling history, if I'm not mistaken.
yeah, so like 33 million people tuned in to watch that match on TV. It's just crazy, even today, to think that record has still not been broken. Um, and yeah, it's just such a clever way that they did it. I mean, it was very very over the top and very kind of 1980s. You had the introduction of Ted DiBiase, the Million Dollar Man, and his big thing was he wanted to get the title belt away from Hogan. Even offered to pay for the title or something, and Hogan said no. And then he acquired the services of Andre the Giant, and he said, if you beat Hogan, then give the title to me." I think it's amusing to look back on that time and see how, like, the amount of effort that had to go into getting the title off Hogan. Like today, people will complain about John Cena never losing clean. Well, Hulk Hogan was definitely in the same bracket back then as well.
Yep, I guess unfortunately people just don't have the same affection for Roman Reigns and John Cena that they did for Hulk Hogan back in the day. As unfortunate as I mean, I guess that's just an indictment to WWE's ability to get baby faces over in 2018.
No, absolutely, yeah. And it's funny, I mean, I think we're still quite a long way away from Hogan fatigue. I think people were still pretty much, accepting that Hogan was the top guy, and they liked the fact that he was the top guy. But like I say, it was a time where Vince needed to look around and see whether somebody else could kind of step into his shoes a little bit. Um, so yeah, WrestleMania 4, initial thoughts on the show?
It's an interesting show. I don't like the atmosphere of the Trump Plaza personally. I think that sort of detracts from the show a little bit. But it's a pretty enjoyable show. I mean, this is a pretty novel format, something that I'd like to see them try again today, even though it'll probably never happen. I know it's quite hard to promote. It's quite hard to promote WrestleMania when you don't have like a marquee attraction to build towards. But this is a novel concept, and I quite enjoyed it, to be quite honest with you. I mean, some of the matches aren't spectacular, and you'd be hard pressed to find anything really north of 4 stars. But I enjoyed the show. I mean, it as I mean, as we said about the previous 3 WrestleManias, they accomplished what they were trying to do.
Yeah, I've always been a fan of the tournament format in wrestling. I know that maybe it's something that you see more in kind of New Japan these days. WWE don't always go there anymore, but yeah, I really like the idea of the show being built around this tournament for the vacant championship. And it's surprising that they've never really done it again. I mean, they did it with the Survivor Series a few years later. But yeah, I think WrestleMania 4 gets a lot of criticism from people for being a little bit too much. I mean, there was a hell of a lot of matches on this show,
Yeah,
which kind
it's
of
a
makes
4 hour show, which we're used to today, but back then was a was a
yeah,
bit of a
a little bit
yeah.
of a yeah. I mean, you just mentioned as well, kind of moving from the Silverdome to Trump Plaza. I mean, I don't know, this show's kind of it's let down a little bit by the fact that you can just see Donald Trump's face in every one of the matches on the other side of the ring. Yeah, I wonder what happened to him anyway. I think he might have gone into politics or something since then.
Yeah, I haven't heard from him in a while.
No, no. um, One thing I'd say about WrestleMania 4, the way it opened with the Battle Royal. I'm always a fan of WrestleManias starting with a kind of non-traditional multi-man match like this. I mean, obviously over the years we've had things like Money in the Bank, Andre the Giant Battle Royal, and kind of multi-man ladder matches. I think it was just a great way to kick off the show with something like the Battle Royal. Did you enjoy the match, the Battle Royal?
Honestly, Dan, not really. I mean, I thought it kind of picked up a little bit when it got to the final 3 competitors. I thought Bad News Brown and Bret Hart were pretty fun, but apart from that, I thought it was pretty flat. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and this was sort of like a babyface turn of sorts for Bret Hart as well, isn't it? So I think that was pretty cool.
Yeah, it was a very great way to establish Bret Hart. Really, I mean, I know he didn't win the match technically, but he definitely came away looking the strongest of everybody. Um, I always think it's a little bit eerie watching it now with because the match ended with Bret Hart obviously taking the title away from Bad News Brown and sort of smashing it up and throwing it around the ring, and it was kind of just eerie looking at it. I mean, more than 10 years later, you'd see Bret smashing up the arena for very different reasons. I just thought that was quite a nice little kind of foreshadowing of what was to come with Bret Hart's career.
Right. It's sometimes I find it quite surprising, to see Bret Hart at some of these earlier WrestleManias because, as a millennial of sorts, I never really think of Bret Hart until we get to like the early '90s. So I mean, it's actually pretty fun to see him on some of these earlier WrestleManias and see the young Bret Hart sort of grow into like the excellence of execution that we later knew him to be.
Yeah, and how ironic is it really that Bret Hart you think of as this very kind of gifted technical wrestler, but he was making his name in WrestleMania 2 and 4 in Battle Royals as well. I thought that was always quite a little bit funny. But yeah, it's always good to go back and see guys that you're very aware of kind of making their debuts. I mean, as we move into the next couple of WrestleManias as well, there's guys there that were starting to make their debuts and coming into the company. Um, but yeah, in terms of match quality overall on the show, I think there were a couple of decent matches in there. Again, a lot of matches on this show, so things kind of get buried a little bit. But one match that I absolutely loved from this show was the Jake Roberts and Rick Rude match that went to a time limit draw. Just two fantastic mid card characters that again kind of is a testament to how deep the roster was back then. Any matches for you that stand out?
I think the obvious one had to be the Ricky Steamboat versus Greg Valentine one. I thought that was a pretty interesting match. In hindsight, it is pretty surprising that they didn't do a rematch of Ricky Steamboat and Randy Savage, because that would have been they would have obviously had a great match, and it would have been a redemption of sorts for Randy Savage to say. I mean, to avenge his defeat at WrestleMania 3. So I mean, that was pretty cool. I mean, Greg Valentine, obviously pretty good technical wrestler in his own right, and the finish in itself is obviously a sneaky heel finish. I mean, you seldom saw heels go over clean back in the day. But I thought those two, for my money, I thought that was the best match of the show. It was only 10 minutes, but they still got quite a bit in and told a bit of a story.
Yeah, I think like we said last time as well, it seems impossible for Ricky Steamboat to have a bad match, to be honest. Um, Another thing I like about that match was just the Jimmy Hart involvement. Like he was a lot more subtle as a manager compared with say Bobby Heenan, but just the way that you can kind of hear him on the megaphone throughout the match, kind of shouting encouragement to his guy. I mean, I really love Jimmy Hart, and I think he's kind of like an unsung kind of manager from the past, because a lot of people obviously concentrate on Bobby Heenan for the right reasons, but Jimmy Hart really had a place in the company at this time as well.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Jimmy Hart was tremendous, and I mean, I always thought that one day he'd be able to do something for the company as like a general manager type figure, but alas, that never came to pass.
Yeah, I know he kind of went into that face turn, didn't he? With later on in '93 when Hogan and Beefcake kind of formed the Megamaniacs. But yeah, he kind of just kind of went off a cliff edge a little bit. He was such a prominent name in the '80s, and occasionally he will make the odd kind of comeback now and again. But yeah, but I think he's just one of these fantastic characters, and just a great kind of heat magnet as well for his stable guys. Always willing to kind of take bumps from people as well, just to kind of get the crowd happy. Again, I think we mentioned it last time as well that managers bring so much to the table when it comes to sports entertainment, especially in the '80s, and maybe we kind of miss them a little bit today. I think.
Then I wanted to ask you: do you think Rick Rude suffer? Do you think how much do you think Paul Heyman added to the character of Rick Rude? I mean, obviously he's not here on the show, but from their work in the NWA and stuff like that, how much do you think Rick Rude actually benefited from having Paul Heyman as his manager?
Um, I mean, I would say that anybody who kind of comes into association with Heyman is instantly given a lot of is helped in their career. I guess it's not somebody you generally associate with as being a Heyman guy. Um, but yeah, I think Rick Rude was just somebody who was able to get himself over no matter what. I think he had that natural talent and didn't really even need the help of a manager. I think he's just one of the best kind of mid card characters that the company's ever had.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Just one more one more statement that we'd have to make is this. Of course, is like some of the last days of this run for Ricky Steamboat in WWF. He'd soon join NWA in like early '89, and he'd have those classic matches with Ric Flair that we all remember and love today.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I total respect for Ricky Steamboat as a performer. It's almost like if he was around today, I think he would be a much bigger star, because we've kind of moved into a time now where wrestling ability counts for a lot more than kind of personality and character and gimmick. And I think Steamboat kind of had a decent character around him, and the gimmick was there. It was very subtle, but his main strength was in the ring. And I guess being in the midst of the Hogan era, I think his personality maybe have been overshadowed by some of the other guys that he was working with. But yeah, I'd love to see him as a kind of character today. I know he kind of made that comeback around WrestleMania 25. He can obviously still go in the ring. I mean, I don't know if it's too late for him to have one more go in WWE at the moment.
I think it may be a little bit too late now. I mean, we're almost 10 years removed from WrestleMania 35, and he's in his mid 60s at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one other match I wanted to mention as well, which was really strong in this card, was the quarter-final match with Savage and Greg Valentine as well. I know we've mentioned him a couple of times already, Greg Valentine. I mean, just a great performer. I've heard some people say he was a little bit of a Ric Flair rip-off, which I think has always been a bit harsh.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit harsh. To be fair, a lot of wrestlers in history have drawn inspiration from Ric Flair. You could even make an argument that The Rock was the late '90s answer to Ric Flair, because he also had the flamboyant suits and the over-the-top charisma. I mean, obviously he was a far better promo than Ric Flair, and even though Ric Flair is one of the greatest promos of all time, but still. Anyway, not to digress. But yeah, I mean, Greg Valentine had his own talents, and I thought he was a fun worker in his own right. I mean, he did borrow a few things from Ric Flair here and there, no doubt. Even using the figure four leg lock. But as someone who's gone back and watched late 80s or the 80s wrestling, I find it hard pressed to just dismiss him in that sort of cavalier tone.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of these guys that was able to tell a great story during a match with just his body movements and his approach to the matches. I think which is quite a subtle but very effective kind of characteristic to have. So I definitely think he deserves to be part of the conversation, Greg Valentine, and just the way that he made it to the quarterfinals, going past Steamboat as well. There was obviously a lot of I think Vince had quite a lot of promise for him. I think at the time, but yeah, I mean, I think that one thing going through this card though as well is that looking back on it now, obviously you know how the tournament kind of finished, and it's almost like, I mean, I know when you watch old shows and you kind of know how the matches are going to finish anyway, but there's even more of that element to this show because you know that it was going to be Savage and DiBiase in the final, but it doesn't take away from the great quality of matches. I guess we have to talk about the Hogan and Andre match, which I think they both got a bye and went straight to the quarterfinals. And again, I mean, this was almost like a rematch from WrestleMania 3, but a very different type of match. How do you think that played out? Do you think it was necessary to go there with Hogan and Andre again?
Um, I, in my personal opinion, not really, but I think, but as we all know by now, Vince McMahon, when something works, Vince McMahon likes to beat you over the head with it. Or to use another analogy, he likes to squeeze every drop of juice from the lemon. So I mean, you can kind of understand why they did it. And to be honest, I think it was it was sort of an effective method of eliminating both men from the tournament, especially considering that Hulk Hogan wasn't going to do a clean job.
Yeah, I know. I mean, like I said before, I mean, the amount of effort that had to go into not letting Hogan win the title again, I mean, it's hilarious, really, to think. But it worked back then, whereas it maybe isn't working today with guys like Cena and Reigns. One thing about that match actually is that I know it ended in a double DQ, but surely Hogan should have been DQ'd because he hit Andre first with a chair. I mean, that's
Yeah. Fair to say that logic wasn't their strong suit back in the day. I mean, not that it is now, but
Yeah, yeah. Another
Dan,
thing
do you
just to
think
mention.
Ted DiBiase would have actually benefited from claiming the scalp of Hogan in this tournament? I mean, he didn't have to beat him clean, but with a little bit of outside interference or distraction or something like that.
Yeah, and I guess that's just another example of the influence that Hogan had in the dressing room. I mean, maybe the idea was put to him, like would you at least try and put DiBiase over somehow? But I guess he wasn't willing to do that, and he thought, I'll get DQ'd by hitting Andre over the chair. That's the way I'm going to lose a title. Fair enough.
Yeah.
I really like the moving away from the tournament slightly as well. The tag team match with Demolition and Strikeforce, two really really strong tag teams back in the day. Strikeforce with Rick Martel and Tito Santana. They kind of like very typical high energy babyface tag team. I think they were quite a big deal back in those days. Demolition winning the belts here, I think, was the right decision. Again, I mean, we said before about Valentine being getting criticism for being a Ric Flair ripoff. I mean, people say that Demolition was kind of a ripoff of the Road Warriors as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they were an unabashed ripoff of the Legion of Doom, but that doesn't mean they weren't popular in their own right in the 80s. They certainly did have a fan following, and people still remember them fondly. However, if you try to present something as blatantly as a blatant ripoff as that in 2018, I'm not sure it would work very well. But then I'd also like to point out that they didn't have like an army of road agents like they do now back in WrestleMania 4, and evidence of this was the fact that they actually used a cane in the finish here. And there was also a cane used in the finish of the previous match, which was Randy Savage versus One Man Gang. So I mean, that little bit of attention to detail was lacking. I mean, so I think that's something that has to be pointed out. And what did you think of Strikeforce as a tag team? Did you enjoy their work?
Yeah, I kind of appreciate their place on the card. I mean, they were a very overtly babyface team. Two very good performers. I mean, but both of them in their own right have had very good singles careers. But I think I think there was a place for them. I think they were mainly for the kind of the younger fans in the audience. I think there were better tag teams around than Strikeforce, but yeah, if they were around today, I think they would be quite a prominent tag team. Yeah, so obviously moving into the sort of final of the tournament, DBRC and Savage. Um, I know this match has gotten a little bit of criticism over the years for having slightly too much outside interference. Would you agree with that?
But I think that was kind of a theme of this WrestleMania, wasn't it? I'd even say that
Hmm.
the Demolition and Strikeforce match was a little bit overbooked in its own right. I mean,
Hmm.
if you're looking at it as an in-ring purist, maybe the finish doesn't work. But from a storytelling perspective, I don't really have too many problems with the finish of this
Mhm.
particular match.
Yeah, I think
I,
that's
I, I
right.
think it's just a product of its time, really.
Yeah, exactly. And I think being somebody who's lived through kind of later years of wrestling, I mean, I can't help kind of making a comparison with Hogan and Savage to sort of John Cena, CM Punk, because I guess there was a time when Vince realised, I've kind of got to take the belt away from Cena a little bit, and I need someone who's going to give me that kind of consistency in the main event scene, and he went with Punk for obviously for over a year. But there was always that element that Cena was still the top guy, and that Punk was playing second fiddle to him. And it felt this way with Savage and Hogan as well. I mean, it took Hogan to come out to help Savage win the title, and it's just, I don't know. It was almost like Vince wasn't fully ready to go full force with somebody new. He kind of had to remind fans that Hogan was still the top guy, but Savage was just going to hold the belt for a little while. Maybe I'm being a bit too harsh. I don't know, but that's always kind of put a damper on the match for me.
Okay, that's fair enough, man. I mean, could you also argue that both Hogan and Punk were superior performers to? I mean, so Savage and Punk were superior performers to Hogan and Cena.
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you're looking for in a superstar, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it's so many parallels I can draw between Savage and Punk because they were two guys that were very, very well known for their wrestling ability, but they also had a lot about them as well, personality wise. Um, but yeah, in terms of through the eyes of Vince McMahon, I guess Hogan and Cena were the type of performer that he was looking to lead the company. But then I guess you always kind of need that kind of alternative. So if fans are starting to get a bit bored of Hogan, they can maybe sort of invest their energies in Savage. But yeah, from a sports entertainment point of view, no matter what us fans say, I think Vince McMahon always saw Hogan as his guy and Savage as a kind of playing backup a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, and I think maybe I think maybe he was taking his cue from the box office. I mean, Hogan at the time was selling a tremendous amount of merchandise. The live
Mm-hmm.
events were doing really well by all accounts, and you can't really blame Vince McMahon too much, as he didn't have like a massive television contract that allowed him to take risks like he does now. I mean, not that he takes very many risks now anyway, but at least he now has that luxury which he didn't back then, as he was certainly
Mm-hmm.
living very hand to mouth.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
I'm sorry, maybe hand to mouth is the wrong phraseology, but he had to draw money at the gate to make a living, basically.
yeah. I mean, he was still, even though WrestleMania 3 was such a great success, he was still trying to establish himself. And a poor WrestleMania 4 show maybe would have maybe led to people questioning how successful he really was long term. So yeah, he was still looking for ways to establish himself as the top wrestling company in the world. And like you say, I mean, you always go to the guy that you can depend on most of all, which obviously was Hulk Hogan back then. Um, One thing I forgot to mention actually, just going back a little bit, was just the sheer amount of, and this is true of WrestleManias 4, 5, and 6, like the sheer amount of tag team matches. I mean, today you'd be lucky to get like one tag team match for the title, and maybe like another one that's been clobbered together with a few singles guys. But back then, you just had this rich depth of tag teams, and now I personally have always felt that tag team wrestling is needed to make a good wrestling product. Um, I think if you look at kind of the New Japan product today as well, they're kind of recognising that, and they're putting more and more tag teams together and kind of making an effort to establish them as sort of consistent tag teams that kind of dress similar and have sort of good, clever names. I mean, do you think that's something that's missing from today's WWE product?
See, Dan, I kind of actually disagree with you a little bit there because I think tag team wrestling has had a little bit of a renaissance of sorts. I believe it's had a renaissance of sorts over the last couple of years. I think tag teams such as the Usos, the New Day, and Sheamus and Cesaro have actually done really well for the company, and I think they put on some great matches on the card. In fact, if you look at 2017, I mean, apart from the times when AJ Styles managed to deliver one of his vintage sort of classic matches, I think the rivalry between the New Day and the Usos has sort of been the standout thing on the card.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's true. And you know, today compared with maybe 10 years ago or so, I think that there has been a renaissance of tag team wrestling. But I guess there's just not as much emphasis on it. I mean, yeah, you've got the New Day and the Usos was, I agree, a fantastic feud between two very good teams. But that was almost like that's almost the exception today. Whereas back then, you could easily have 3 or 4 tag team matches that had a little bit of story behind them. I mean, it's kind of almost there, but I think they're just not as willing to go the whole way with the tag team division today. I don't know if you still disagree with me on that. I don't know.
So maybe I think it'd be kind of hard to disagree with you on that, Kurt.
But yes, going back to the whole dynamic
But the
of
one
Hogan
thing
and Savage.
I would say is that from like a commercial standpoint, it's really hard for a mid card act or a tag team to be that much more successful than the New Day were at their absolute peak. I mean, at their absolute peak, they were quite hot. They were selling merchandise, and they were one of the things to watch in WWE, I feel.
Yeah, although I don't know. I mean, it's a sign of the times of, and I know Vince was very into his kind of merchandise sales back then as well. But you know, and I guess this is going to be something else that you disagree with. But you know, as much as I love the New Day, I don't know. They were kind of they spent like a couple of years just kind of being that the marketable merchandise sellers, and I think that kind of undermined them a little bit. I don't know. I can sense some. I can sense some division between us on this point.
Yeah. Which we need because we're agreeing way too much.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, but I was going to say with the dynamic of Hogan and Savage that we were speaking about a little while ago. It was a great way though to kind of lead into what happened a year later, and it's kind of a good way to kind of lead on to speaking about WrestleMania 5. I mean, you kind of that dynamic that we've been talking about kind of became a reality in terms of the kayfabe story that was being told between them. I think Savage always had those kind of seeds of jealousy towards Hogan, and always kind of knew that his place was kind of underneath and kind of existing in Hogan's shadow a little bit. And it's a great way to kind of bring that to reality when it came around to WrestleMania 5. I guess before moving on to WrestleMania 5, though, I mean, any kind of final thoughts on WrestleMania 4 as a show, and where would you rank it?
I think if you're looking at it from like the in-ring quality, I think a lot of people would have it in the lower tier of WrestleMania shows. But for me, I think the novelty of the concept in itself is enough for it to propel it to like the sort of to like the middle of the pack for my money, really.
Yeah, I agree. I've always felt people kind of rated the show too lowly. I really do love going back and watching it, and like you say, because of the novel concept and because of the tournament idea, the fact that Hogan wasn't the champion, and you could tell that Vince was trying to move the spotlight onto other guys. The way that it started with what I thought was a strong conclusion, at least to the battle royal with kind of Bret Hart's face turn. I think there's a lot in this show to go back and take from it, and I think kind of fans of today that might naturally kind of shy away from the Hogan era because it's not the kind of wrestling they recognise. I think there's a lot of matches and a lot of action in this show that they would also appreciate as well. So I would encourage a lot of younger fans to go back and watch WrestleMania 4 as a kind of example of what the kind of Hogan era of WWF could be.
Yeah, and I have just two more takeaways from the show that I'd like to state.
Mm.
I This show made me appreciate Randy Savage more than I did previously, because he did like certain things, like these small, minute attention to detail, things that he had, which just which made the match more greater for me as I was watching it. I just felt like it enhanced the story and things like that. There were a few
Mm.
bad finishes all over the place, but certainly the first time I watched it, I was intrigued by the story, and I thought the everything surrounding the heavyweight title was well done.
Yeah. What do you think of just generally of Miss Elizabeth as a manager for Randy Savage? Do you think that there was something that she added to his character that he wouldn't have been able to get without her?
Certainly. I think she was an integral part of his success. I don't think we remember Macho Man Randy Savage as a star we do today if it weren't for her.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair to say. Yeah. Okay, so maybe moving on to the WrestleMania 5 show here. Again, a really kind of compelling storyline that led up to the events of WrestleMania 5, obviously with the Mega Powers kind of going into the rest of the year as a solid, very popular tag team. And then you kind of had those seeds of disagreement and jealousy being planted with Savage towards Hogan, and the kind of slow breakup of the two. And again, I think I think it might have been main event again, where that famous scene where Elizabeth was kind of knocked off the apron, and then Hogan picked her up and took her to the back and kind of left Savage on his own to fend for himself. And then Hogan would come back later, and Savage would just kind of slap Hogan in the face and walk off. And that was like the first kind of telltale sign that the Mega Powers were breaking up. I thought that was really well done.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. I mean, that's the thing. When has I like we asked this question on our last episode, but when has a slow build ever worked in professional wrestling? I mean,
Yeah.
Triple H and Batista sold 1 million pay-per-view buys because they did because they did a storyline which and they subtly hinted towards certain things, and they built it up beautifully. Triple H and Batista are big names in the professional wrestling business, but we're not talking about Hulk Hogan versus the Ultimate Warrior. We're not talking about The Rock versus Steve Austin, and we're certainly not talking about the NWO versus Sting.
Yeah, exactly. I think we said, didn't we, before we started recording, that the last kind of WrestleMania show that we really remember looking forward to was WrestleMania 30. And again, it's owed to the fact that there was a very strong storyline being told over a long period of time. Um, I think it was, I think I remember. I'm going off track a little bit here, but the lead up to WrestleMania 31, because you had Reigns and Lesnar in the main event, and I remember a lot of people kind of mocking the fact that the Raw before WrestleMania, you had Reigns and Lesnar kind of doing a tug of war over the title, and people were saying, from a company that's given us storylines like Macho Man and Hogan and Hogan and Warrior, and this is what we get today: just two guys with no business kind of being together, just kind of wrestling over the championship belt. I mean, it's just a sorry state of affairs as to how WrestleManias are built up today, I think.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a pity. I think one of the things that the product certainly suffers from is the fact that Vince McMahon is far more capricious than he ever has been. He seems to make absurd decisions on the dime. Like, for instance, we had the United States Championship tournament on SmackDown recently, which is supposed to conclude at the Royal Rumble, and for whatever reason, they decided to move the finish of the tournament up 2 weeks. I mean, it's these sort of like bizarre things here and there which they do, which ultimately don't pan out. I mean, I think if
Mm.
they just stuck to their long-term plans more often, I think the product would be far better than it is today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it goes without saying. I think I don't know whether Vince was just maybe better at hiding it back then. I mean, I'm sure there were things that were thrown into the long-term plans that kind of made them have to change their minds at the last minute, but it didn't come across, at least in the product. It felt like they had a very strong control over what was going to happen, and I mean, even so, main event WrestleMania 4, you've got Savage and Hogan involved. Obviously, Hogan in Savage's corner in the main event match, and you can tell that Vince is probably sitting there thinking, in 12 months' time, this is going to be my main event match. I'm going to put Savage and Hogan together. You know, WrestleMania 5, we kind of introduced the Ultimate Warrior character a little bit as well. And again, it's like, in a year's time, this is going to be my main event for next year's show. And it's that kind of foresight, I think, that's really, really missing from today's product.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And Dan, in hindsight, do you think it was the right decision to go with the Ultimate Warrior? I mean,
Hmm.
at WrestleMania 6, there's no doubt these two personalities coming together, these two larger than life characters coming together was a big deal in its own right. But
Mhm.
after that night, it seemed like the Ultimate Warrior wasn't what he was. In other words, I don't think he was a megastar when he wasn't paired with Hulk Hogan.
Hmm. Uh, that's a difficult one, I think, because I think you've got to factor in the fact that Warrior has never, well, he's really not had a very good relationship with the company over the years. I mean, yeah, they reconciled at the last minute, which was very kind of heartwarming. But I think there's been a lot of WWE propaganda put out against Warrior. So I kind of feel like we people from our age group kind of have a revisionist history kind of take on Warrior's career. But I think especially if you were a child at the time, living through this era, I think Warrior was an incredibly popular superstar. And again, I think Vince was kind of responding to what the fans wanted. I mean, um, I don't know whether Warrior was initially tipped to be as important of a star as he was, but I think he was very, very popular.
Right, yeah, I think that's fair enough. That's fair enough. And, the thing with wrestling, unfortunately, is the peak of someone's character arc per se is when they win the world championship at WrestleMania. After that, sometimes it's just hard to know where to go with them.
Mm.
Another example of this would be Daniel Bryan. He wins the title at WrestleMania 30 in tremendous fashion, and he then moves on to a feud with Kane. I mean, fair enough. It's partially WWE's fault because you shouldn't give anyone Kane. Kane should never be in the world title picture because he's Kane, the epitome of mediocrity. But still, the Daniel Bryan story was told by that point. He had chased the title for an entire year, and he was done. But in some
Yeah.
cases, like with Stone Cold Steve Austin, he has this great foil with Vince McMahon, and he just becomes an even bigger star. So
Mm.
I mean, some of it is luck, but sometimes the audience is only invested in you till a point, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah, I was going to say how fortunate it is that Kane has finally been taken away from the main event scene and the title picture, heading into this year's Royal Rumble.
Yeah, could
Yeah.
you imagine him choke slamming Brock Lesnar?
Oh God, I don't know. Again, I mean, it's not a match I'm looking forward to. I'm kind of looking forward to it in a way because it might be a complete disaster, and that's always entertaining. But yeah, much respect to Kane over the years for the character he was, but I agree he's got no business being in the title picture today.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
Dan, I mean, can you imagine if they had to put him in the title picture of the Royal Rumble, they had to feed him up and coming guys like Finn Balor or Seth Rollins or somebody like that. They'd never let those guys lose to Kane anymore, would they?
yeah, let's move swiftly on from this. But I think, but to your point though, with kind of what to do after you kind of reached the apex of WrestleMania, winning the title. I think it kind of it shows the importance of having really good feuds. I mean, you can have a superstar who's very very over with the fans, but if you haven't found like the guy to kind of pair him with. I think that kind of diminishes his value in the company. Like Stone Cold, fantastic character, but his feud with Vince McMahon was what made him, and you could always go back to that if you needed to. I think with Bryan, it was almost like where do we go from here? He's beaten Triple H, he's beaten Randy Orton, he's beaten Batista. There isn't that one guy that we can go back to other than Kane, and I guess like you say, as a feud, it just didn't encapsulate people's imagination as much as maybe him versus Orton.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. So do you think we should move on to WrestleMania 5? I think we've dwelled on the Ultimate Warrior a little bit too long.
Yeah, sure. So, my initial kind of comments on WrestleMania 5, I would say that it is a one match card, but I don't mean that in a bad way. I think you can have wrestling shows that are officially classed as one match cards, but Doesn't mean that they've not got a very good and strong lower and middle card. I think it's just the fact that the whole thing was built around the mega powers imploding. Um, I think if it wasn't for say Savage and Steamboat, you could even say that WrestleMania 3 was a one match card because it was all about the main event and Hogan and Andre coming together. Don't know whether you would agree with that, but I think there was some very decent, strong matches in this card. But it was kind of all about leading up to that final moment of seeing Hogan and Savage go at it together.
That's true, and I agree with you. Unfortunately, there isn't a Ricky Steamboat Randy Savage match on this card, but there are a few hidden gems there that I think you can enjoy. For instance, I thought Ted DiBiase versus Brutus Beefcake was fun for like about 10 minutes or so. I thought the Mr. Perfect match was pretty good as well, and I certainly enjoyed the Piper's Pit segment.
Yeah, really a few interesting debuts as well on this card. First WrestleMania for Shawn Michaels as part of the Rockers. You kind of forget. I mean, you associate Shawn Michaels now with the great singles career that he had, but it's really easy to forget how fun the Rockers were as a tag team.
Right, absolutely. They were a lot of fun, but for some reason, every time I see Shawn Michaels in the Rockers, I have a hard time differentiating him from the legend who went on to have the singles career, just as you said.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I know.
For some reason, it doesn't have
Similar
the
as well.
same novelty as seeing Bret Hart at WrestleMania 2. I don't know why.
Yeah, I know. I think maybe it was little bit later on when people started to realise the true value of Shawn Michaels. Where I think with Bret Hart, it was kind of there straight away. The guy just kind of oozes charisma. I think with Bret Hart anyway. Um, another match that I like was just the opener. Actually, you had Haku and Hercules in a one-on-one match. It was kind of like former Heenan guy versus current Heenan guy. Um, and Haku was a fantastic character at the time, like really good in the ring. I mean, there's quite a few examples on this show of matches that would actually stand the test of time today in terms of the athletic ability and the wrestling ability. Um, you mentioned obviously the Mr. Perfect match. Another guy that made his debut for the company, well, a WrestleMania debut for the company at least, and the guy that was facing the Blue Blazer, who obviously we all know who that went on to be. Yeah, exactly. And again, and it's just an example of a lot of the seeds being planted for future years. I mean, you had people in the opening matches like the undercard, Shawn Michaels, Mr. Perfect, Owen Hart, Bret Hart made an appearance a bit later on, obviously, but it was almost like these were the guys that were going to lead the company into the kind of mid 90s, and they were already there making a name for themselves back here at WrestleMania 5.
Also, how great does it feel to see Arn Anderson on the WrestleMania card?
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And again, put on a great match, in my opinion, as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, his fingerprints are all over modern day WrestleManias, but you never get to see him in front of the camera doing his thing.
Yeah, exactly.
He's one of the. For context to some of our listeners who may not know what I'm talking about, Arn Anderson is one of the most influential producers in WWE today.
Yeah. You also had the splitting up of Strike Force as well, which is quite a big moment on this show. Martel kind of walking out mid match and turning heel. He went on to have a pretty decent career as it was the model Rick Martel that he became after that. I think that was quite a big moment as well. And again, some really good strong tag team matches on this show.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. Like you've been saying, Dan, for the last two episodes, tag team wrestling. Tag team wrestling certainly presents some of the best matches on some of these early Mania cards.
Yeah, I think it's just needed. I mean, it breaks up the kind of monotony of having just singles match after singles match after singles match, and I think the WWF at the time weren't afraid to kind of throw in a little bit of fun into the tag team matches as well. I mean, they'd normally have managers come out like Heenan or Jimmy Hart to kind of just give it a bit that extra bit of entertainment factor. And again, it's something that really helps these shows, I think. for me, the WrestleMania 5 really came into its own in the second half of the pay per view. Firstly, the Jake Roberts and Andre the Giant match, I think, just told multiple stories all in one go. I think it was fantastic. Two very, very compelling characters. You had the whole subtext with Andre being afraid of Damien, and then you had DiBiase come out to try and kidnap Damien. I think that was just a really, really fun match to go back and watch as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a pretty fun match in its own right. What do you think about
Mm.
the finish, though?
Um, yeah, I don't. I think I said this last time. I'm not. I'm okay with matches not finishing clean sometimes because you don't always want. I don't think you always want a clean finish because you're trying to tell a story here. I mean, it was almost like the story was more important than the in-ring action in this match, so it didn't really need a kind of 1, 2, 3 pinfall finish or a submission or anything. The idea was that Andre was scared of snakes. You knew that as soon as Jake Roberts brought out Damien, that Andre was just going to just run for the hills. I'm okay with it. I think it sort of rounded off the story quite well.
Yeah, I thought Andre's face was like incredible, like when he sees the snake.
Yeah, I mean it's. I certainly wouldn't say that Andre is an unsung hero, but there are elements to his character that get overlooked as well. I think he was a great kind of in ring psychologist, going against probably the greatest in ring psychologist of all time in Jake Roberts. That really really helps this the overall show this match. I think it was very very solid.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, we'd be remiss not to touch on the Ultimate Warrior match, no, considering the role he'd have with next year's WrestleMania.
Yeah, and I think it's really it's easy to kind of overlook how important this feud was, Rick Rude and Ultimate Warrior. I think that there were stories that you hear from people, and again, this may just be part of WWE's revisionist history, but there's stories of people maybe being a bit unwilling to work with Warrior because they knew that he wasn't the safest guy to work with. I think it was this show where he picked up Heenan and gave him a whatever his finisher was called. I can't remember now. And then Heenan kind of saying that uh, the Gorilla Press, yeah. I think Heenan saying that it wasn't executed very well, and it kind of injured him a little bit. Um, and I think Andre even was somebody who said that Warrior will never be a top star for the company because he's just not a safe worker, and it took somebody like Rick Rude to come along and say, well, I'm willing to work with Warrior, and I'm willing to kind of give him another dimension to his character. And maybe, Warrior wouldn't have been in the position he was a year later if it wasn't for this feud with Rick Rude.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's not underestimate how much Bobby Heenan helped in his progression as well. For instance,
Mm-hmm.
when Warrior goes after Bobby Heenan, the crowd just goes berserk, and at that point, this is the number two babyface. This guy's on the path to being the number two babyface in the company.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean, yeah, the way the match ended as well with Heenan kind of holding Warrior's legs down. I mean, it's just, yeah. You struggle to find somebody who Bobby Heenan didn't help to reach the top level.
Right, right, right. Um, um, Jim Ross always says Jim Ross always says that in his opinion, Bobby Heenan is the greatest performer in the history of professional wrestling, and while we might have our favorites and we all have our biases, obviously, it's quite hard to argue that position.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, yeah, okay, and then moving into the main event of WrestleMania 5 with the Mega Powers imploding, like we say. Do you think it's fair to say that this was maybe the first kind of truly great WrestleMania main event, both in terms of storyline and wrestling?
Yeah, I thought this was a very good match, very good match. This was 4 stars for my money without question.
Mm.
And was this the best match of Hogan's career up to this point?
Yeah, if you're looking for like an all-round performance, I think yeah, definitely. Savage might be one of these guys that can have a decent match with pretty much anybody. But for all of the criticism that's levelled at Hogan for not being the greatest in-ring worker, going back and watching this main event here, Hogan wasn't just somebody who could get the crowd buzzing. He was also somebody you could go to put on a fairly decent match given the right opponent as well. And I think in the history of kind of WrestleMania main events, I think this is one that I always go to as one of the best, perhaps.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. I would say this is among the 10 best WrestleMania main events without question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a great kind of involvement of Miss Elizabeth as well, because she was kind of torn between which one to go with, and there was just those little subtle things that you said before about Savage kind of putting Elizabeth in the way so that Hogan wouldn't get to him, and just a great use of the Miss Elizabeth character again here.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's tremendous.
Mm-hmm.
And Savage is, as we spoke about in the last episode, Savage is even better when he's playing with heelish tendencies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah. I mean, I liked his involvement in WrestleMania 4 as the kind of number two babyface of the company, but I think his personality was allowed to show itself a lot more when he was the dastardly heel. I mean, I don't want to dwell on this point too much, but obviously you can't ignore the subtext going on, because I know that Savage and Elizabeth had their own kind of personal problems, and there was rumors of him kind of mistreating her a little bit, and it's weird how that came out in the character as something that really got him over as a performer, but in real life it's maybe like a little bit of a black mark against him.
Yeah, it's most unfortunate, and as we all know, they divorced later in life, and they moved on their
Mm.
separate ways, and they're no longer with us.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as great a pairing as they were in professional wrestling, off the screen things were not so harmonious. It's
Mm-hmm.
by all accounts they didn't have a great marriage.
Yeah, and do you think, obviously with Savage being inducted into the Hall of Fame recently, do you think Hogan was the right person to do it?
Um, Bit phony, no?
Hmm. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. I just felt that it was felt a little bit fake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. From a storyline point of view, it made sense, but yeah, just the stuff that went on between the two of them over the years, maybe it was a little bit contrived, I guess. Yeah. Sorry, that was a that was a tough question to throw at you out of the blue. There, I do
Yeah,
apologise.
how I don't know. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's probably anybody else that would have been able to do the job there. It's just, there's an element of wrestling always where you have to separate reality and fiction. Um, if you were a kid living in this time and you kind of saw the on-screen friendship between Hogan and Savage, then yeah, it would make perfect sense. When you look behind the curtain, you see that reality is just a little bit different.
But as you said, I'm kind of scratching my head. Can't really find anyone else.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's move on to this. Move on from this dark, this dark conversation we're having here. So yeah, WrestleMania.
By
Oh,
the way,
sorry.
when actually did Randy Savage go into the Hall of Fame? Was it last year?
Was it? Oh dear, I can't remember now. It was Warrior in 2014. I think it may be in the year after. Was it with Savage?
Okay, okay.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, long overdue, but it's
But
great to see him
you're right.
finally inducted.
It couldn't have been last year. Hogan was in the shithouse by then.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, okay, so
Do you think Hogan should be welcomed back into the company?
um,
I know it might be that's a slightly tricky question, but
well, I threw one at you, so it's fair that you throw one at me. Um, I think so. You know, there's always been a bit of an irony, or well, not an irony, a kind of hypocrisy, I guess, with WWE over the years, where they cherry pick cases of racism that they don't like, but they're fine with other cases that they do like. I mean, you need to just go onto the WWE website and search for Donald Trump, and there's just all this information about him and his involvement in the product, and nobody seems to have a problem with that. I'm not condoning in any way what Hogan has done or said over the years, but he is a character that led to the WWE being what it was today, and we wouldn't be sitting here talking about the different WrestleManias if it wasn't for Hogan's initial involvement in the company. So I'd be happy to see him back, as long as he had a very kind of careful script to read and didn't kind of go off on one.
uh,
Yeah. What do you think? I'm gonna turn it around on you.
See, it's a tricky one because it's a tricky one, especially for someone like me who hasn't really grown up in Western culture. So,
Mhm.
but I kind of I'm not really a part of the political correctness brigade, so to speak, or this
Mhm.
sort of like modern like mob justice sort of thing where you're like if you make one mistake, um, if you make one mistake, you can never get. You can never, you should be condemned for life or whatever. I think that if the sponsors are okay with it and they can do it without inducing too much negative publicity, I mean, why not?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I'm not really a proponent of the outrage culture, so to speak.
Yeah. Okay. So final thoughts on WrestleMania 5. Where would you rank it in terms of the shows they've done over the years?
I think this one I'd have to put in my upper tier, and I quite enjoyed the show. Again, I think the venue is horrendous. Maybe it's because maybe I'm subliminally associating it with Donald Trump too much or whatever. But I think the atmosphere doesn't do the show justice. I think this is slightly above average. But if it um, if it weren't for the arena, I think it could have been a lot better. I think if you had it in say in Chicago and you had like a great crowd there or something, it would have been much better.
Yeah, it's. I feel terrible saying this, but it's almost like there's always going to be that one redeeming feature of Donald Trump that he kind of likes wrestling, no matter what he does.
He can go into nuclear war with North Korea, but as long as he likes wrestling, he's okay with us.
Exactly. If he hits a promo before he presses the big red button, then I'll be okay.
It's cool with
me. Yeah. So moving on to WrestleMania 6, and I think relating back to something I said previously about the WrestleMania 5 show being a one-match card in a good way, I think WrestleMania 6 might be an example of maybe a one-match card done in a bad way. I will give it this. It definitely felt like a big deal. The arena was like an adequate size. The presentation of WrestleMania 6 I thought was very good, but maybe the actual action in the ring wasn't particularly the best. Just before we kind of go into any concrete details about the show, any kind of general thoughts or feelings from you about this particular event?
So I mean, obviously, and I think the main event was very good, but there were a lot of really bad matches in front of a dead crowd, and that didn't really help matters. But something we'd be remiss not to mention is that this is the show that sort of spurred on the wrestling fandom of one Adam Copeland, who's famously in attendance at the show as a Hulk Hogan fan.
No, of course, yeah, we can't ignore that, and yeah, for all the negatives on the show, at least we've got that to hold on to, I suppose.
And as we've now come to understand, Toronto's always going to be Hulk Hogan country.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're right. I think there was. The big problem with this show is that there was a hell of a lot of filler involved, which I think is something that maybe you can't really forgive because the roster was still very, very deep and talented at this stage. But it's just something about the pairings of the different competitors was a little bit off. There are a few points on here. The tag team title match with Demolition and Colossal Connection, whilst being an okay match, I guess it did lead to a very kind of memorable WrestleMania moment with Heenan kind of getting angry at Andre and slapping him in the face, and then kind of the face turn for Andre the Giant. I think that was really needed. I think Andre couldn't have gone out as a heel. I think we needed to remember how much we kind of respected and admired him as a babyface as well.
Right, and this was also Andre the Giant's last WrestleMania. We'll never see him again on the showcase of the Immortals.
Yeah, and that's definitely a sad moment. I think he appeared in the next show, but not as an actual competitor.
Right.
But yeah, no, it's his last match. Yeah, I don't know. Like, do you think this is a match that was befitting of him? There's obviously limits to what he could do in the ring by this time. But are you happy that he kind of got that big moment at the end with Heenan?
For sure. It's not like Demolition were popular for their matches anyway. I thought the last 3-4 minutes of it were pretty well done. I thought that was quite fun to watch and everything. And Bobby Heenan, everything the man touched at this point of time was pretty much made for incredible television. So,
Absolutely, you can always rely on
yeah,
always
I
rely
mean,
on Heenan.
is there a better way to go out than by decking Bobby Heenan?
Yeah, and it's how it related back to the incident leading up to WrestleMania 3 and how Heenan kind of brought Andre back, but kind of infected his mind and turned him into a bad guy, and then it kind of the story came full circle with Andre kind of realizing that Heenan really wasn't interested in him, and just kind of had the ultimate payback. I thought that was really well done. I mean, any other matches on this show that, other than obviously the main event, which we'll obviously get to, but any other matches on this show that you kind of remember that stood out as positive or decent?
I quite enjoyed the Macho Man Randy Savage and Sensational Sherry versus Dusty Rhodes in the Sapphire match.
Yeah.
Sapphire obviously had Sapphire was what Sapphire was, but I thought Sensational Queen Sherry was a very good heel at this point in time. Honestly, I think she did some incredible work,
Yeah.
and she did everything possible to make Sapphire look credible. But things could have gone a lot better. Um, but watching Dusty Rhodes on this stage just sort of has this like incredible. I don't know how to put this, but like Marvel versus DC sort of feeling, because you come to associate him with War Games and the rivalry with Ric Flair and all of his great work in Jim Crockett Promotions / WCW. So it was quite surreal, but King Macho Man versus Dusty Rhodes in a singles match may have probably been preferable.
Yeah, I think that was a lot of fun. I think that match, and like you say, with Sensational Sherry, I mean, I think it's really easy to understate her kind of contributions to the company at this time. I think she was a fantastic kind of heel heat magnet for a lot of people. I mean, obviously with Savage at this time, and then she'd like move on to people like Shawn Michaels later on as well, and help them kind of develop and take that next step. Yeah, I mean Dusty Rhodes. I mean, what do you make of the polka dot gimmick? I mean, there's been a lot of said over it over the years about maybe it was just Vince's way of having a little bit of a dig at his main rival. I mean, do you think that's fair? Do you think he kind of made the best of it in that sense? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if it was that. I don't know if Vince McMahon's intentions were that sinister, but I think for sure he didn't understand the appeal of Dusty Rhodes. Vince, if you, I don't know if you'll agree with me on this, but I kind of feel that Vince McMahon doesn't always book that sort of common man, working class underdog very well. I think he captures lightning in a bottle like very occasionally, and most of the time it's sort of thrust upon him. Daniel Bryan, Chris Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, that sort of character. So when the fans sort of thrust upon him and he has no other choice but to go with it, is when it sort of works. I think Vince McMahon excels at like creating ass-kicking sort of tweener type guys like Braun Strowman, Brock Lesnar, Stone Cold Steve Austin, etc.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think there's probably a political element into that as well. I mean, Vince is a self-confessed Republican. I don't know if he fully gets the whole kind of working man concept in everyday life, but yeah, like occasionally it will be handed to him just from kind of fan pressure or whatever. Yeah, and that's a really good point. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like I've always the polka dot gimmick. I think it's maybe a little bit unfair, like what people have said about it over the years, but. If there was definitely an issue somewhere with Vince wanting to bring Dusty Rhodes in as the kind of common working man, and I don't know whether they could have just gone with that rather than give him this kind of flamboyant gimmick. But I think he handled it very well, and this mixed tag match was a great example of it, I guess. Yeah, I think for me, I mean, you've got the match between DiBiase and Roberts for the $1 Million Championship. I personally love the $1 Million Championship. I know that Ted Jr. is no longer with the company, but I kind of liked how he brought it back a few years ago. And this was a fairly decent match with a little bit of a silly ending, but two kind of effective mid-card characters in the company at the time going at it. And I guess for me that it's just an example again of they had a decent roster at this time and they probably could have done a little bit more with it than they actually did. I mean, is that a match that kind of sticks out for you, or did it kind of just pass by?
I think the match I can kind of pass by, but I think the promo he cuts before the match is unbelievable. The Yeah, I think that's one of the finest promos that Jake Roberts has ever cut. I mean, it's not very long. It's probably like 2 minutes at most, but he delivers a message. The cadence is on point, and this guy really should be at the performance center teaching young wrestlers how to cut promos.
I mean, to say that was one of the best promos that Roberts ever cut is really saying something, because there was a hell of a lot of them.
Absolutely.
I think also a bit of a talking point about WrestleMania 6 was the kind of the backstage incident involving Larry Poffo, the Genius, and Brutus Beefcake. Don't know if you're aware of this. With the so basically the Genius gets his hair cut by Beefcake, just as something that Beefcake normally did after his matches, and apparently he wasn't fully aware that it was going to happen, and there was like a bit of a backstage altercation between Beefcake and Randy Savage, obviously, who was the brother to Larry Poffo. I mean, have you heard this story?
Oh no, I've never heard the story before, but I find it to be utterly hilarious.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a theme at this time with Savage kind of getting into a lot of backstage altercations with other members of the roster, but you can kind of see where he's coming from on this one. Apparently it was not a very nice experience for the Genius. Nobody really told him exactly what was going to happen. So yeah, but it's definitely a talking point on this show.
But why do you think they had Brutus the Barber Beefcake beating Mr. Perfect in the first place?
Well, I don't know. Beefcake was always one of those characters. I mean, I don't dislike the Beefcake gimmick, but I think it was always one that Vince saw more in than the fans did, because he was kind of like, I don't know if like a modern day example might be somebody like
Roman Reigns?
I don't know. Oh well, I wouldn't go that far. No, like that's maybe somebody like Jack Swagger, almost like a kind of, we kind of get it, and it's like not a bad gimmick, but for some reason Vince just kind of cheaps kind of push it on us. I mean, he doesn't anymore, obviously, because he's not with the company, but he just seems to find himself in a lot of these kind of high profile spots when maybe his talent and his kind of ability wasn't really there. That's the kind of comparison I would draw. But yeah, it was a bit of a strange decision on that match, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's just these certain things that Vince McMahon sort of gets fascinated with. I'm not exactly sure what the thinking was behind Brutus the Barber Beefcake, but
yeah,
I think every man and his dog knows that Jack Swagger was a failed attempt at creating Kurt Angle. I mean, Jack Swagger is obviously a very, very talented athlete. Great amateur wrestler in his day, but he was not presented to look like anything credible on WWE television.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they kind of did something okay with his the kind of anti-Mexican gimmick they did around. Was it WrestleMania 27 or
29? I believe it was.
29, yeah. Like it kind of had a bit of meaning to it, and like the backstage video segments that him and Zeb Colt used to do were actually quite entertaining. But if
I remember, a few people from the Tea Party movement actually got quite worked up about it, and they even had this segment where Michael Cole go to like the office of one of the Tea Party leaders who was very anti the angle, and sort of and they sort of asked for comment, and they did a whole shtick with it. It was quite funny.
Yeah, like a modern day example of the WWE kind of being on culture almost, which they don't do enough anymore. But yeah, that's probably just an example of the wrong man in the right gimmick, I guess.
Yeah. Also, a pity that it didn't have a better foil than Del Rio, but yeah.
True. Yeah. No. I guess it's like reflective of the show in general, really. That I'm kind of resisting the urge to kind of just jump straight to the main event. I don't know if there's any other comments or things you want to say before we do that.
Not particularly, to be honest. What did you think of Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty's performance on the show?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I thought that was actually a pretty exciting match.
Yeah, I think the Rockers were, found it difficult to have a bad match at this time, I think. Maybe this would have been better as the kind of the show opener. I think the Rockers have this ability to get the crowd kind of riled up and kind of put on a very kind of attractive tag team display. Kind of being lumped in the middle of the card a little bit was maybe not utilising the full potential.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. They could have potentially gotten lost in the shuffle in this sort of position, and for sure. Could you tell at this point that there was something different about Shawn Michaels?
I think so. I mean, you're always going to be you're always going to have that filter of looking back and knowing what you know now. But yeah, I think there was just a difference in. Well, I think there was certainly a difference in the crowd response to Michaels compared to Jannetty, and I think people knew it even back then. Maybe they didn't fully know how far Michael's career was going to go, but yeah, there was definitely something more to him than Jannetty. But again, that might just be me looking back, knowing what I know now. I'm not sure.
Yeah, for sure. It's sort of hard to look back onto that without those goggles on, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I guess I mean the main event is what this show is ultimately built around, and you can argue that if a WrestleMania finishes on a strong match, then it really helps the kind of overall judgment of the show, even if the rest of the show is a little bit weak. But yeah, big time main event between the two biggest baby faces in the whole company, and I think it's fair to say that for all the people who dismiss both of these guys as not being able to put on a good match, this actually wasn't bad. I mean, there's two big guys kind of playing to their strengths and stuff, and you didn't expect like technical big flips and kicks or anything, but for what they were, I think it was a well executed match.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'd be remiss not to mention that closing sequence as well. But where would you put this up with Hulk Hogan's greatest matches?
I think if you're taking into consideration everything, like the importance of it, the spectacle, the backstory, as well as the in-ring action, I think I'd put it as one of the highest actually. I have this natural tendency to place Andre and Hogan above anything else, as I just think that's just a moment of magic that can't be replicated. Maybe kind of the Hogan Savage one maybe would come in second because of the storyline and the action being probably better. So maybe put this third behind those two.
You'd put it above the Rock match?
Oh, I didn't know we were taking in. Oh, I didn't know we were considering that one. Okay, no, fair enough. No, that would probably come fourth then, I guess. But yeah, in terms of like the '80s, early '90s Hogan era, I think this deserves its place above the best.
Fair enough, and this is certainly without question the best thing that Ultimate Warrior's ever done. I mean, this is his moment in the sun, and while he did draw money for WCW a few years down the road, there is no question that this is the pinnacle of a memorable career, and it's no shame peaking at this stage of the career because many legendary professional wrestlers never had a big moment on this sort of platform.
I'm going to slightly disagree because when we come to next year's event, WrestleMania 7, I personally, and this is just my experience, the Ultimate Warriors match against Savage was I think slightly better, but we'll get to that. But I totally take your point. I mean, yeah, this in terms of the height of his career overall, this probably was the pinnacle. And yeah, it's kind of a little bit of a rare creature, I suppose, the Warrior. I mean, his career didn't have the longevity of some of the other greats that we mentioned, but his name is always mentioned above the top stars that the wrestling business has ever seen, and it's because of moments like this, I think, that kind of result in that.
And you can't underestimate the fact that children who were, marking out to him growing up are now in positions of power, and they sort of shape the narrative about professional wrestling to a large degree. It's the same reason I think that no matter how great the in-ring action is today, we'll never admit that it's better than the Attitude Era.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And another thing as well, you can't you have to kind of separate the WWE's propaganda over the years because they've had a lot of issues and problems with Warrior, and as they have with Hogan as well, but like probably more so with Warrior.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's easy to kind of dismiss that Hogan was the big star and Warrior was the kind of the second in command. I think that's a little bit mistaken. I think at the time, I think there were kind of like the Warrior fans that were kind of ready to ditch Hogan and kind of jump on the Warrior bandwagon if he'd stuck around. So, as a kid at this time watching this main event, it would have been really, really special for you, because it's just the guy that you've loved and admired for so many years facing against your kind of new favourite, and I think that story was told really, really well.
For sure. It's that sort of magic that you only really get in professional wrestling, because in how many other forms of sport you get to spend this much time with your characters and watch them gradually build up and get to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's the particular magic of professional wrestling, I think. And I think WrestleMania 6, the ending to it, kind of really encapsulated that. Well, one question I'd probably throw at you here is that there's been a lot of stuff said over the years about, as good as this match was, it kind of set a little bit of a difficult precedent going forward, because traditionally speaking, with professional wrestling, your main event should be focused around the ultimate good guy versus the ultimate bad guy, and like the good versus evil narrative is always the strongest one to go with. Whereas because this match was so much of a success, I think it kind of changed Vince McMahon's perspective almost overall, and thought, if I can just put two larger-than-life characters together in a ring and just kind of let them go at it without any kind of build-up in terms of the animosity that exists between them, that's enough. Do you think that's fair?
I'm not really sure, because, but that's certainly the most logical explanation you can come up with.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even to this day, I mean, you traditionally see good guy versus bad guy in probably 80% of your WrestleMania main events.
Mm-hmm.
But for sure, as long as you have two guys who have an aura about them and they're just like over with the fan base, and the fan base is sort of invested in their result, I think that's certainly one of the lessons you can come away with from this show.
Yeah, I think I suppose what I mean is that if you look back at the previous two WrestleManias, so you had the show that was built around Savage's attempts to win the title after DiBiase had kind of tricked Hogan out of it. That told a good story which you could follow logically. WrestleMania 5 again was like a story that was built up for over a year between Hogan and Savage, and you had a clear delineation between the good guy and the bad guy. WrestleMania 6 is kind of like an example of what Vince does today with, say, Roman Reigns and Brock Lesnar, just kind of throwing them together randomly. I mean, there's no real reason, storyline-wise, for Reigns to go after Brock Lesnar other than the title. And maybe that's just me being a kind of traditionalist, kind of wrestling purist who likes, storylines and narratives, I guess. But, WrestleMania 6 was probably like the first example of that happening, where you didn't have this kind of structured story leading up to it. It was just kind of throw this guy together with this guy and hope that the magic kind of comes from it, I guess. Maybe I'm probably thinking about it too much.
No, to be honest, now that you mentioned, I actually agree with you a lot, and I think in some ways it does the WWE more harm than good, because they sort of keep trying to reach for this sort of magic every time, and it's just not there very often. It's very seldom that this sort of quote-unquote dream match, if I could call it that, comes together and works very well. In professional wrestling, it's always going to be the narrative that sells. It's always going to be following a character's arc and watching them triumph on the biggest possible show. That's going to be what draws you money.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think, and again, maybe I'm just overthinking it, but it's just something I always thought about this show. Is this is like the one blemish on that main event that kind of, I think, it just set a bit of a bad precedent. But it was a great match. Were you like the whole issue with Hogan being unwilling to put people over? I mean, was it a surprise to you that Warrior did go over here?
So to be quite honest with you, when I watched this match for the first time, I was really young, so I didn't really know about Hulk Hogan's reputation for not really doing what's best for business. So I can't really admit to that. What about you, Dan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny as well. Like, people say, Ultimate Warrior got the win, but I think Hogan kicked out after the third count. So it's like, yeah, technically Warrior won, but only just.
Only, yeah. And he had the magnanimous gesture at the end.
Yeah, again, that kind of it's kind of a foreshadowing of what we'd get with like Cena and Rock. Like WrestleMania shouldn't finish with two men holding up each other's hands. It should be about the good guy overcoming the bad guy again. It's just it's a little bit of a blemish again here, but no, and again, like I say, I mean, it's reflexive of the show that we've spent most of the time talking about the main event, because I think that was the main point of WrestleMania 6, and the rest of it you kind of could take or leave, really. I mean, any kind of closing thoughts on the
Would
show?
you mind if we digress a little bit?
Sure, yeah, as ever.
So I since I didn't actually watch this in real time, I wasn't even born when this show went on the air. So since I didn't exactly watch the show live, I didn't really have as much of a problem with the handshaking aspect of it. Whereas when it came to Cena versus The Rock, I was almost nauseous because I was I was a hormonal teenager who wanted to watch The Rock kick John Cena's ass, and after the heated build up and them sort of like sort of like doing the reality era type shtick and going after each other through various platforms and everything. These two guys just coming together and saying, this was all a work. We're just going to shake each other's hands and move on. Just, just didn't sit very well with me.
Yeah, and part of that as well is that it didn't really make a lot of sense from a storyline perspective either, because it's not like Rock had a torch really to pass on. I mean, Cena had been the top guy for like 15
absolutely.
years.
It was nonsense.
Yeah, exactly.
But well, we were only ever going to get once in a lifetime. Oh wait.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm digressing here, but like, do you think if they would have done a triple threat with Punk at WrestleMania 29, that would have helped him like stay around? Because everybody knows that Punk wanted a main event WrestleMania, and this probably was the perfect opportunity to do that, because we didn't necessarily need Rock and Cena again. I mean, this could have had Punk's involvement as well.
Yeah, for sure, maybe. And if Punk never turns heel and he stays a babyface and he does great things that year, maybe we're not seeing this Roman Reigns push today.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one actually. It's going to be one of those talking points for a long time. Whether if Bryan wasn't so injury prone and kind of forced to retire, whether Reigns would have the position he had today.
I think the answer to that question would be no, because they were already sort of positioning to move on from Reigns according to the dirt sheets.
Oh, okay. No,
or at least that's my opinion.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but then in wrestling you've got the kind of fans' opinion and Vince McMahon's opinion, which isn't necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I guess in wrestling traditionally it's always been the guy who has the vision and not the one who's sort of like capriciously reacting to things. That's emerged as being successful. So you can't really fault Vince for believing in what he believes in, but I think he sort of takes it a bit overboard. He's sort of adamant at this point.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's I don't know, his advanced years at the moment as well, where he probably just doesn't care as much. He's like he's made his decision, and like this the position that the company's in now, it's not going anywhere. There's no real rival that's going to kind of challenge the WWE in terms of its like dominance on the wrestling market. So he can kind of do what he wants. I mean, back at WrestleMania 6, he was kind of there, but he still had some threats. And like if he hadn't have paid attention to making these shows as good as they were, then it's conceivable that another company might have taken over. But you don't really have that today, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. And back then, you couldn't sort of just put WrestleMania on the marquee and have 60,000 people in attendance. You actually had to have a main event that got people invested on the show. It's not the case today. You can put together two people that nobody cares about, and people still fly over to the States from all around the world.
Yeah, exactly. I think one thing we haven't mentioned actually is this is the first WrestleMania that was held outside of the States. I don't know whether that's like a significant point, but it's like, it shows that Vince was willing to kind of broaden his horizons a little bit. And I mean, again, it goes back to this idea that it really did feel like a WrestleMania. I mean, like the previous 2 years being held at Trump Plaza, maybe kind of let down the overall presentation and the feel of it. I mean, is Canada, would you say, like the second biggest market for the WWE still?
Possibly not, because I think the UK has become a fairly big market for them too in recent years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, haven't had a WrestleMania yet, but you know.
Yeah. I think the pesky time difference is what's keeping you from it, though.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's ever going to happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, so any closing thoughts before we end? I mean, we'll be looking at the next three after this, but anything you want to say about any of the shows we've talked about on this podcast, so 4, 5, and 6?
I think that's a wrap for our I think that's a wrap for our coverage of WrestleMania 4, 5, and 6 on my end.
Cool, fantastic. Well, thank you very much again for listening, everybody. We'll be back next time with our reviews of 7, 8, and 9. Some very interesting topics to talk about in that next session, so stay tuned. Okay, thank you.